Hej och varmt välkomna till kvällens föreläsning på Konstakademin med Stockholms arkitektförening. Jag heter Josef Eder och Elisabeth och jag är kvällens värdar och presentatörer. Jag tänkte bara kort berätta att om en vecka så har vi en annan föreläsning här och det är med en landskapsarkitekt som heter Robin Winogrand som har kontor i Schweiz. Och titeln på hennes föreläsning är In Search of Geographical Re-enchantment. Så varmt välkomna om en vecka på den föreläsningen. Jag tänkte också passa på att berätta att det är ju galatider för Sveriges arkitekter. Och i samband med det, den 7 april, så kommer Stockholms arkitektförening att vara värd för galans efterfest, eller stora fest egentligen. För galan har ingen egen fest, utan den är vår. Så att jag hoppas att ni kommer till Follan i Slakthusområdet och har en kväll med oss där.
Bar. Stockholms absolut längsta bar.
Ja. Stockholms absolut längsta bar, ja. Välkomna dit.
Free drinks. And fun.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn to English. Having worked for James Sterling in London and been taught by Shane Blackham in Dublin, who in turn had worked with Louis Kahn, Sheila O'Donnell and John Tuomey were instrumental already in Group 91 Architects in the 90s, generating architecture as a culture of craft and social life, when they engaged in master planning Temple Bar in Dublin, turning it into a rich urban fabric of old and new, inventively knitted together, celebrating city life. And in effect, Group 91 helped preventing a large section of the inner city to be torn down, and it is today one of Dublin's most loved and lively areas. This type of interest for architecture sustaining life, paired with a profound sense of craft, both in thinking and making architecture and making space, is the foundation of an impressive series of outstanding buildings. Buildings that engage in the site where they are placed, in Ireland and across Europe. And it has resulted in prestigious awards. The list is very long, so I can't read it out here, but let me mention just two: the RIBA Golden Medal 2015 and People's Choice Award. Wonderful that you span the whole range for the best building in London over the past 10 years for their LSE building. Along these impressive works, they have also, and I think this is very important, developed a culture of architecture through teaching in Ireland and abroad. And I think in these rather dark times, when we need more than ever long for no-nonsense thoughts and works, SA is really honored and very happy to present to you Sheila O'Donnell of O'Donnell and Tuomey Architects. The floor is yours, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Stockholm, so I thank you for the invitation. It's actually my first visit to this fantastic city, and I know that I will be back. Tonight I'm going to talk about recent work that I've made with my partner, John Tuomey, using the title Conversations with Place, because our work is deeply engaged with place in how to respond to the particular characteristics of each site, but also how to make places within our buildings. I'm going to just read a few pages of text, and then after that I'll talk just to the images. Every inhabited place is defined by and read through its buildings and its constructed landscapes. We converse with space in a number of different ways, which include representations of place and memories of places which may or may not be accurate. Memory is interesting because it gives us ownership, and what we own is our own impression, which then becomes a real thing. Because I think in architecture, you're always somehow drifting between the real and the actual, and your observations of places are as important as the measurement of the places. And place is also not just a physical phenomenon, it includes aspects of time, culture, ethos, essence, and of course, society. We talk about our buildings being designed from the ground up and from the inside out. And in that context, I think of both ground and inside as being aspects of place. When everything is in its place, everything is all right, it's good. We're not looking for abstracted perfection or ideal forms. Our designs are derived from careful study of constraints by a process of close noticing of local conditions. Our intention is to arrive at a form that speaks back to and makes new sense of its situation, to approach a deeper sort of simplicity through acceptance of the complicated origins that make up the shape of things. Our university building in Budapest, which you see here, is embedded within and between existing buildings. It talks to those buildings in many ways, and this image is of a visual conversation with its 19th century neighbour across the street. By using the same material and by pulling back from the street line to give a pocket of space, the new building invites the old one into its world. Slide is not moving. Hold on, I'll use it here. Nope, still not moving forward. Tried this too. Sorry about this. It was working half an hour ago. Not if you're right. I'm sure if it restarts, it'll work. Tack. Okay. So, sorry, to pick up where I dropped out there. In Cork, the Glucksman Gallery floats above the ground in response to the trees, protecting their roots while allowing the branches to brush the windows of the building. In Connemara, the new structures of the Furniture College respond to the texture and matter of the mountains. They lean with the direction of the wind, and they're lifted off the ground to allow the constant rain to flow under them to the bog below. Understanding the sense of place in a place is always a starting point in our work. And we also aim to bring to our work a sense of place learned from other places. The landscape writer Tim Robinson, who I'm going to talk about later, said that it is the basic act of attention that makes a place out of a location. To me, this idea of the act of attention partly defines the architect's task. And there are some places which we just keep revisiting because of the intensity and certainty of their sense of place. We walk through the constructed landscapes of Greece and the west of Ireland, looking at walls, terraces, hilltop forts. We feel a strong sense of similarity between these two landscapes and between their archaic vernacular cultures and sensibilities. But of course, we know that that similarity is most likely in our own way of looking, absorbing, and understanding these places. We look at tiny chapels and stony landscapes where a simple seat or a step defines a threshold and establishes a sacred arrival place, while at the back, the pure white form of the building is built into a rocky landscape. Vernacular chapels are situated in their landscape with the same certainty as the classical structures in Delphi. And whitewash unifies the forms. It becomes the material they're made of. And we're always looking at steps and seats and at how these elements mediate between building and ground. We enjoy the zigzag geometry of a West of Ireland pier with its rough board-marked concrete, the grass growing on its surface. And sometimes how the man-made makes use of the natural. A concrete promenade here uses a natural rock outcrop to define containment, and the natural and the man-made become one. Or indeed the natural can take on the guise of the man-made. The sea, in this case, cuts a perfectly rectangular pool in a limestone platform in the Aran Islands. The ancient quarry of Ignatia, of course, is man-made, but it has been claimed now by the sea and by time and become part of the landscape. This noticing grounds us in the everyday. These simple structures celebrate the ordinariness and specialness of a threshold. Irish tower houses, ubiquitous throughout our western landscape, have always fascinated us, but we were surprised to find a whole town of these familiar structures in the south of the Mani Peninsula in mainland Greece. The small house we built in Navan is a tower house and a hill town, two buildings arranged across a court. It cuts into the ground and it rises above it. The Howth House and the Ranelagh School, designed at the same time, are concerned with building the site, cutting and filling to navigate level changes and to connect the building to its ground. The school site is small, so new ground is made on the roof, where a light timber and steel structure provides covered outdoor space for learning and play. And at ground level, the veranda and corridor, stuck again. Here, the slides aren't moving again. Yep, thanks, that's fine. At ground level, the veranda and the corridor act as a single space between inside and outside, where the building and the site become one, a contingent space where people can pause before committing to enter. So the next phase I'm talk about is talking to trees and air. In Cork, in University College Cork, we've built now 3 projects, but the one I want to talk about is their University Art Gallery, which is located in a remarkable piece of ground here. This is before the building was built. And the beautiful river runs through the site, and there are mature trees. And this is an area known as the lower ground, which was a kind of sacred place in the campus where people thought it should always remain as landscape. And the new president decided he wanted to build an art gallery there. And there were a lot of social problems and issues of people being threatened. So they felt building would make the place safe. So we thought about people's concerns and about their desire to keep this sense of the enclosed landscape. So we made a decision, looking at the photo on the right, that we would keep every tree, and that we would only build on what we felt was the kind of developed ground of this site, which is actually an old tennis court no longer in use, which was a hard tarmac surface. So those 2 decisions in a way guided the project. And the idea of keeping the trees was that somehow the building would be almost like a tree house. It would sit among the trees, and that this sense of landscape with the lower ground, as it's called, with the trees, and then the limestone escarpment on the left, somehow is defined. We wanted to keep that sense of definition of the place. So our project raises the gallery and the usable spaces above ground with big cantilevers so that the structure of the building doesn't interfere with the roots of the trees, and it allows the trees to continue to exist really close to the building. And then because of the level change on the site, you walk across from the avenue over the cafe and the storage areas down through the site. So in a way, the building is divided into two parts, one in the air and one of the ground. And then within that, the building kind of twists and turns to take in particular views of the campus. And we're very interested in this idea about balance and contrapposto, as you find in sculptures, for example, of Bernini. The idea that the balance of a building might almost be twisted on its base, and that the building then is allowed to face in different directions and to have this sense of a kind of asymmetrical stability. So you walk under the building. If you just want to visit the lower grounds, you don't have to go in, but in a way, you experience the building without going in, and the galleries are raised above. And the plan on the right is the gallery plan. So in fact, all the exhibition walls are straight walls, but where they turn a corner, the corners are curved. And then the windows are in a way outside the gallery spaces. You step into a triangular space and the windows connect you with the trees and the buildings on the campus. And I suppose the other important idea about walking through this section is taken, you would be walking through this space. So the cafe is underneath and the galleries are above. And we've hollowed out a kind of upside down courtyard so that when you're walking through, as in this photograph, you can see into some of the galleries at first floor, but because you're totally sheltered, it's no daylight, it's no reflections. You see completely into those galleries. And this was it was a way of making it clear to students walking through the campus what was happening in the building, that there are exhibitions, that there are events in this building, so they can choose either to engage or not engage, or they can engage simply by looking in from outside as they walk under the building. And then when you're inside, when you step into these window spaces, you're in a space between inside and outside. In a way, you're in the trees and you're in the gallery, but there's a kind of, it's like there's a low ceiling in the windows, so you're in a kind of space between. And then the view of the building from the ground is that the path runs through and is an external route, and then that you have the cafe under, and pulled aside and shifted in this contrapposto relationship is the gallery above. Talking to real and imagined places, we've done a number of installations in Venice in the Biennale, and it's always a kind of interesting and difficult challenge to exhibit architecture, because if you're exhibiting art, painting or sculpture, you exhibit the actual works, but at an architectural exhibition, you're normally exhibiting representations of works. So this Capriccio by Canaletto of Palladio Buildings we found really interesting, where Canaletto collected a series of both built and unbuilt buildings by Palladio and put them together in a kind of new place invented by him, an imaginary place. And yet it's real because some of these buildings are really built and because they're fully designed. So our installation in 2018 in the free space, Grafton Biennale, the title was Folding Landscape East and West. And we were thinking, this is on the one hand, just a little building or an installation in its own right in a conversation with the Corderia, but it's also a representation of two projects unbuilt, which we were working on at the time. And the first one is the Robinson Research Centre in Roundstone on the west coast of Ireland, which is a really interesting ongoing or possibly not ongoing project, which I'm trying to have happen. And it's there's an existing house on the site here, which is the house of a wonderful man, Tim Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, who's a cartographer, a writer, an artist, a mathematician, who's lived he lived from more than 30 years in this house on the end of the pier in the village of Roundstone, which is a very special village in the west of Ireland. It's always had many painters and artists visiting, so there are lots of artistic representations, and it's a planned town, planned by a Scottish engineer in the early 19th century as a single-sided town facing out to the sea. So there's a straight street of houses, and then he also, Nimmo, the Scottish engineer, also designed the pier. He designed many piers in the west of Ireland. And on the end of that pier is the house of Tim and Mairead Robinson, who both sadly passed away during the COVID lockdown. But Tim this is a portrait of Tim in his studio, a wonderful man who, as I said, he came from England to live in the Aran Islands in about 1970. And because there was no map of the Aran Islands, he just decided he had to draw a map. And then he had to learn the Irish language because he needed to put in Irish place names. And he subsequently, he has an amazing way of describing and giving back to us our own landscape. So we all in the west of Ireland understand our place more because of Tim's work. And so his maps, which this is a part of one of his maps, he made 3 maps in the end, are very much about place name as well as about the shape of places. And the place names are a huge part of people's understanding of the history of these places. And most of the names on the Ordnance Survey maps in the 19th century were translated roughly badly into English. So Tim went back and found what the original Irish names were and put them all on the maps. So when we started looking at his place, we brought students there maybe 10 or more years ago. And the first task we set our students was to make a map, a survey, but it's like a map of Tim and Mairead's house. And they drew the house with every piece of furniture and the books on the shelf and the bottle on the table and the bedspread on the bed was a kind of starting point as a mapping of the house. And then these are these 2 wonderful people, 2 elderly people living in a kind of genteel poverty in a place that looks out at this wonderful landscape. And we were commissioned by the university in Galway, to whom Tim had agreed to bequeath the house, to make a design for a research centre to continue after his death, a research and exhibition place. And I made these drawings on the site, just thinking about the relationship between the house and the landscape and the views and how that might evolve. And then we went on holidays to Greece in the middle of thinking about that. So I started drawing these amazing stones, the hard obsidian and the tufa rock, and thinking about weight and lightness and different types of concrete and construction. And because we were on our holidays and were thinking about the design, we end up making this model, which is like a sketch with one of those stones and some pencils and a pencil sharpener. So it's a kind of model where the pencil sharpener is the lift shaft and the stone is the big room and the pencils are the studios. And then we came back and the people in the office drew up this project, which really adds to the existing house and makes a wall of research studios along one edge and keeps various elements of landscape that Tim developed in his garden. And is, well, there's this kind of a sad story that Tim died and then the university turned down the bequest to the house because they didn't want to take on the expense of doing it up and running it. And they had received his archive already and absorbed that into the university. So our project was to make these big rooms with big roofs that bring light in for exhibition, for meeting, for projects, and then that would be made in a kind of concrete mix using local seashells and sand. And when we were invited to Free Space, we made this installation. It's like a little building, really. And this is a 1:2 model of that big room we were making in Connemara. So we sort of built the project at 1:2 here, but we also made it like a sort of a landscape, a place that you could step onto with seats and benches, because we're obsessed with seats and benches. And this also, it's about having a conversation with the amazing brick columns in the corridor, and particularly with the window. So the main intention of this project is to make a stairs that you could walk up so you could actually look out the window in the corridor and see the canal below. So we selected a bay where there is a canal outside, and this, in a way, so the building is, it's an installation to let you look out a window and look at some brick columns, but it's also a representation of a project, and it's also like a Greek chapel in the landscape. It's a whitewashed structure which has its own kind of presence, and we worked on this actually also another year in Greece. So while sketching these chapels, I was also sketching ideas for this installation, which is about itself as well as being about these 2 projects. The second project is an opera house in Shanghai at 1:10, which we lost the competition, and I'm not going to say any more about it. But the installation has little spaces underneath. It's like an Irish shrine where you can walk behind and look at drawings, and there's precious places with gold leaf. And then there's a sense all the time of people moving through between the brick columns and up and down this whitewashed structure in this place. I mentioned in the introduction that sometimes we're talking to or conversing with representations of place. And I really am quite obsessed with maps. And I suppose, obviously, the Nolly maps of Rome are among the most wonderful maps ever made. So we tend to go every year to Rome in January for 5 days. And I always take a set of photocopies of bits of the Nolly map, the bits I know I'll be in. And every day I draw a line in a different colour pencil of all the routes that I take on that day. And what happens is over 5 days, the map, because it's usually 5 days, and luckily there's only about 5 colours you can tolerate seeing on a map. So you build up a kind of intensity around where we stay near the Pantheon. Is completely woven with lines that move backwards and forwards and cross over each other. And then occasionally you just find little places that you only visit once, which are special. But what I find is this really interesting dialogue between observing and understanding and looking at the map and looking at reality. So sometimes I come home in the evening, I draw all the lines, and then I see somewhere on the map and think, how come I've never been in that corner? So the next day I go back to it. Or I'm walking through the city and I suddenly see, in this case, a set of really interesting angles, and I look on the map and find that they're there. But the angles on the map are so subtle you'd hardly read them, whereas in reality, they're actually quite strong. So I found that this is a really interesting way of understanding place, to see how it's drawn and then to walk through the drawing at the same time. And in a sense, you come to own the place by inhabiting the map. And in Venice is a similar, I mean, in a way in Venice, the map isn't as important. It's not as, this map isn't as brilliant as an Ollie map, but there are these experiences. This is a little street, Calle Stretto Lipari, on the way between, the way between the Accademia and the Frari, two of the most important sort of tourist visited places. And at the last minute before, just before you come through to the Frari, you walk through a gap that is about 900 millimeters wide, less than a meter. And this is a major pedestrian route to the city. And you see the light beyond of this, the Frari, the light on the Frari of a public space. And it's such an interesting thing to realize that in reality in cities, you have these compression and release are so important that if everything, if you were designing that now, the traffic engineer would say it's got to be 5 meters wide. And you say, no, it doesn't. It can be 0.9 meters wide. And I think over the years, this is an early project we did for the Irish Film Centre, which is a set of existing buildings. And we have a beautiful map of Dublin from the 19th century, which I kind of scratched and carved our project into. And it's a project weaving between old and new, and using existing corridor that comes through into this tall space. And I think that the sense of the spaces that we're trying to make here really are something that we have learned and continue to learn, particularly by the spaces in the city of Venice. And another project in the north of Ireland in Derry, which is an Irish language cultural centre, was on a bizarre site with just one short frontage to the street and 3 blank sides. So all the daylight and all of the entrance had to be on this short side. So we, in a way, kind of carved a route into the middle of the site, and then we made a tall space that reaches up and brings light in from the sky. It's like a sort of inversion of a tower house, but it is also, in a way, working with that kind of spatial intensity that we get in those cities. Talking to the city, talking to Dublin, could be up to 10 or 12 years ago, we finished a social housing project in the Liberties area of Dublin, which is a really traditional historic residential area, but on the edge of a kind of 19th century industrial Georgian also. So it's a really interesting place. And I suppose this moment where you enter the project, where there's a very narrow gap from the street, is very important. It's on a site, as I said, that this is, we looked at all the historic maps. This is a 1750s map, and the stain in the middle is our site. And in the 1750s, this was a really densely built Georgian part of Dublin. And it got eroded in different ways over many years. But finally, Dublin City Council put this huge new road through, which they call a street, but it's not a street, it's a road. And it kind of they knocked down half of Georgian buildings and exposed a sort of frontage, which then we were asked to design this project in. And our idea was to build a new, it's almost like putting a repair, like putting a sticking plaster on a wound, to build a new front to the street, which varies in height to allow sunshine to come through, and which makes a kind of urban, has an urban quality. And then in plan, we wanted to make a public space, but because of the new street going by, it would be a lot of traffic. So we spent a long time looking at the site, and we realized that if we made one of our buildings parallel to that street and the other building parallel to this street, that we actually come up with a triangular space that is narrow on the noisy side and then opens out to the side where all the other residential streets of the area are. So on the noisy side, looking to the street, you have this very narrow compression, and it captures this very beautiful early 19th century industrial building at the back of a Georgian house. And then in the other direction, the buildings slope down in height to relate to the scale of all these streets of houses which move off towards the north of the city. And we wanted to make a really Dublin building, a building which relates to the kind of character, material and mass of Dublin. We're really interested in these Georgian houses, and our observation that because of the way the Georgians built in such a practical way, that there's a door, and then on the ground floor there's a room with the window in the middle. Then upstairs, the room is the full width, and its windows are symmetrically located, which means that they don't line up over this one. And so you see another one here where the window slips in relation to the door. And we thought that was a really interesting thing. What that does is it gives the brick wall a sense of being a stretched surface. So in this project, which is lots of tiny apartments and rooms according to the minimum space standards, we use this idea of stretching the brick wall and pulling the windows apart in a way where they needed to be in relation to kitchens and living rooms and bedrooms, and then making this quiet space, which is sheltered by being narrow at one end, and then has little moments with tree planting and steps and seats where outside each house there's a recess on the ground floor and places that children can play, but also at the same time there is, at the top of the building, there are these what we call little winter gardens which project out and give the residents views back over the city. And the building has a kind of presence with this big sloping roof with the terraces cut in the landscape of that part of Dublin. At the moment, we're working on 3 new social housing projects, which we, after 12 years, we finally were allowed to do another social housing project by Dublin City Council, and they're working at a somewhat different, bigger scale. And our idea is we're trying to make courtyards with deck access, with double height decks, which are wider on 2 levels, with a lot of planting and a sense of connection with the garden and an external stair, so that there is it's like a sort of winter garden, that there are these stepping double height terraces and balconies opening into a garden, and then the residences space out around the city. They're in the Guinness area of Dublin, which is has existing buildings of incredible, beautiful industrial scale of 19th century, 10 and 11-story buildings. And on another small site, a little corner, the one that I used to look at on my walks, that there's a vista down a long street to this little corner site, and we're just making a building which has a building which turns to face down that street, and then it just wraps around a little garden. And again, we're working with ideas about decks and community. So now I'm talking to another city, which is London. In 2009, we won a competition to design a new student centre for the London School of Economics, and a kind of amazing site at a moment in the city of London where where Kingsway, which was built in about 1900, drives its way through a previous medieval network of streets. So you get a kind of combination of straight edges and knotted streets, and it's a really complicated site, triangular in shape. And the project was to make a student centre which has very many different functions, all of which wanted to feel that they were public and were almost on the ground floor. So and they wanted to feel in some way connected. So, but it had to be, it's 2 stories below ground and 6 or 7 stories above. And what we decided was we wanted to make a building that had a kind of singular integrity as an object, as a thing, like a sort of brick mountain. And because the first day we went to the site, we just felt so strongly that it should be a brick building in the context that it's in. And so the site is this triangle, right, just corner ways off Lincoln's Inn Fields. And there are all these streets that come up to it are all part of LSE campus, because the campus is a piece of city rather than an enclosed ground. And the sketch on the right is the sort of early plan sketch we were doing. And in our minds, yet again, of course, was Venice. But this amazing place in Venice, it's a little pensione we stay in sometimes, where you look out and you see these 2 buildings which frame a view to the Grand Canal. And it almost feels like those 2 buildings are moving in relation to each other because of the kind of geometry, and maybe because there's water between them. And we were thinking about how the students will be coming up these different streets, and we're making a kind of triangular cut here, and the big room, which is the nightclub in the basement, in this corner. At the same time, another aspect of that is the sense that you get in Rome when you're walking up the little streets and you see this incredible big building, but you only experience it as a fragment until you come into the space. And that was very much how we realized that the student centre would be experienced, because the students are coming up, they just see a little bit of it. And in fact, we designed it in perspective. So we used perspective drawings of how you would catch glimpses of this building as our way of developing the design. And as I said, we're making a kind of cut in at the ground floor to give you a covered outdoor space, and then you come and move up through the building. And when the drawing on the right is the competition plan. We had this idea of somehow using the site geometry to establish a right angle in this corner, which remained and was where all the kitchens and toilets and things occur. And then, in a sense, to try and carve out and move between things, particularly the lift shaft as a kind of totem that you could move around as you moved up through. And I had been on holidays in Greece making these maps, called swimming maps. So we're staying in a house here, and every day I take a swim out between the boats. And when I come back, you can see I really am obsessed with maps. I would map between the boats the route that I took, and then a bit like the Nolly map, the next day I would think, oh, I've never been over that bit, and draw another piece. And there's something really interesting about the spatial condition of being in water between objects like boats, which are actually not still, they're slightly moving. And in a way, the space that you're in, which is the water, it's both space and it's object. And I think when we were trying to think about how you would move through this building, there's a kind of positive, negative aspect of space. And we thought of the lifts in the building as being a bit like the way that you move between the boats, that in a way they kind of redirect you and suggest how you move. And then the brick. These were the competition drawings zoomed in. Because the building had lots of different kinds, some very public, some very private spaces, like a prayer center and a gym and a dance studio, which need to be somewhat sheltered, and then other spaces that want to be very open. We came up with the idea of using the brick as a combination of some places solid and in other places perforated, so the light is coming through the stretched bricks, and this is how the building is in its finished form. So some rooms are covered with a kind of screen of brick, and other rooms are solid. And we also decided we would cut no bricks, and the reason for the form relates to regulations about rights of light. The building had to step back as it went up to avoid shadowing others. So because they're handmade bricks, this is part of our exhibition in Venice in 2012. These are some of the molds that the bricks are made in, wooden molds. And you can make a brick any shape because you just have to make a wooden mold. And the drawing on the left is a drawing that an amazing woman, Laura, in our office made of she did, I don't know how many, there's maybe 100 different kinds of special brick in this building, and she drew them all three-dimensionally and in plan. And then that gives us this sense of a kind of continuous mass, that there isn't a joint at the corner, because every corner is made by a brick that is shaped. And the geometry of the building comes out of this kind of underlying grid we developed out of the site geometries and the connections across different parts, which gives us the plan where the stair and the lift. The stair effectively is like a public, we had the idea the stair is like a little lane, one of the lanes that's on the site, and you come up and you wind around the lifts, and then you come to the front door of the gym or the cafe or the different aspects that are in it. And then outside the place we carved back, we built this timber and steel canopy to give a kind of loitering contingent space before you go into the building. And in the competition, we were thinking about the stairs as being this kind of dynamic space that you move through and move around. And the building pulls away where the stairs is from the back walls, so small courtyards bring in daylight. And sometimes the stairs winds back on itself and you see into the radio station or the gym or the different activities that are on each level. So the movement of the stairs becomes a kind of dynamic of the building. On the first floor, there's a big cafe which is completely open, facing out towards Lincoln's Inn Fields, and in the competition we were imagining it that from there you're looking under the canopy to the outdoor space, and the photograph is how it was built. And then in the section there's 2 floors below ground, which is a big disco, and we've brought daylight into that by having these cut here and a cut here. But this one also means you can look down and you can see the lights of a band on the stage from the street level. And then at night, the building, because of the perforated brick that you read in a way, it's like a big brick basket. It's like an illuminated basket of brickwork. One thing we were very pleased with is at the end of the project, we were asked to do the external landscaping by Westminster City Council. So the materials and the spaces and the light fittings of the building continue out into that space, which in a way means that the building extends beyond its own boundary. And this was a drawing that I found the day we heard we won the competition. We were surprisingly in Greece. I just found these 3 red stones on a beach full of smooth white stones, and I just thought, well, it's just exactly like our project. So I made this painting of a kind of summary of the moment of winning the competition. In Budapest, we're not just talking to the city, but we're also talking to old buildings. We did a project which was finished in 2016 for the Central European University, an amazing campus in the middle of downtown Budapest, in a set of beautiful existing buildings, adjacent but not interconnected. And the project we built, which is the phase 1 of the overall campus, consists of 1 completely new building and 1 refurbished and transformed building. And this is a moment actually in the old building where you see the old brick wall, but there's a new concrete stairs that winds its way through. And we're really interested in this conversation between the old and the new. The site was a remarkable site in the city. There's the Cathedral, St. István's, and here's the Danube. And the site is this set of buildings, beautiful courtyard buildings, which the university owned. And our concept, just at the competition stage, was that we would put a new entrance here on the visual axis with the Danube, and you would work your way then through a series of courtyards, some existing, some new, and eventually come out onto this street. And Budapest is an amazing city of courtyards. We spent a long time walking around and studying these interconnected yards. The most famous probably is called the House of Seven Courtyards, which is a string of 7 courts interconnected. So we felt that from the start that our project would be about courtyards and about connections. And this was the survey plan of what the place was like. These really thick walls, because you're legally prevented from connecting through to adjoining properties. But we said, I mean, maybe the most important drawing in our competition was that we said you should go from that to that. We should just open up connections, and the whole place should become a kind of interconnected warren of courts and rooms. And on the left is a photograph after it's finished of the old building, which is, so what we did was we knocked down that early 20th century building, which wasn't filling its site, and built a new building here, and then we refurbished it, transformed this one. And that photo is in here in the old building, carving a new space through the old. And these images are among many that we often think about the idea of how you make connections between things which are separate. And one is this amazing Portico di Ottavia in Rome, where there's a kind of layer, a palimpsest of there's the ancient, there's Baroque, there's medieval, there's Renaissance, and then there's this man running his little taverna behind a plastic curtain, all layered on top of each other, and all making the kind of character of the city as it is now. And then the Gordon Matta Clark amazing conical intersect that he made in Paris on the buildings that were being demolished to build the Pompidou Center. He just did this incredible project, which by cutting holes through a number of adjoining buildings gives an incredible new perception of buildings which are separated by party walls. So our idea here is that we would take these existing buildings, and to make it into a single university, that's the old building there, with a new roof on its courtyard, that we would just make these cuts through and stairs that connect into the new building. So we would be connecting the university by these built elements. And then we roofed the courtyards because climate is very extreme in Budapest, and the design of this sharp angled courtyard is completely driven by the direction of the sun and ventilation and avoiding heat buildup. And so what it means is that in this, they wanted the courtyards to be covered for indoor events, but the professors wanted their offices not to open into that acoustic space. So this fresh air comes down to here, and this bridge goes through from the inside to the outside and then connects into the new building here. And that's that bridge as it moves up through outside and inside. And eventually there's a roof garden, which has a fantastic view of the Hungarian parliament, which turns out to be the enemy of the project. But because there's no open ground, there's a wonderful roof garden with productive gardens, and they grow vegetables for the cafe. And then at the ground, the building is stone. This is the new building with its seat and its recesses. And then in the plan, the new building is here and the transformed building is here. And the new building has its entrance to one side because we needed to put in a big auditorium, and all the old buildings enter the courtyards from the middle. And otherwise, but it also means that this entrance route can connect into the next door building. And our new building comprises a series of courtyards which are roofed and are quite small, and some like this one go right up through the building. And in that building there is the auditorium I've mentioned, there is a full new university library, there are conference rooms and meeting rooms. And then so the public part is this concrete stairs winds its way through behind the auditorium into this courtyard, which is part of the library. And the red box that you see here is from the building next door, the old building. So in the plan, the existing building, as you come down the corridor or the stairs, you can just step through the wall and be within the library of the new building. And then the library has this big rooflit space and many layers of reading, and little spaces looking over the Danube, and different senses of different kinds of places to study and read. And the facade, so we've made a new facade, which you can see from the view down the Danube, which is made in a local stone. It's a local limestone called Suto, which is, we found wonderful, we went to the quarry and then we found wonderful stone markers. So all these window mullions are made in solid stone. And the quarry north of Budapest has been in use since Roman times. So a lot of this stone went to Italy also. Some travertine in Italy comes from the quarries in this part of Hungary. And we found the stone we were going to use in the building, and they said this, okay, we're going to set aside this piece of stone. What really struck us when we went there was that the quarry, in a way, felt like the facade of our building. We were really sort of surprised to see it. It has these beautiful holes in the stone. So we used the stone quite thick, about 80 millimeters, and that was important. That would have this weight, and then you get the mullions and solid parts which are in a conversation with the building across the road, which is made in exactly the same stone hundreds of years ago. And then the facade kind of pulls back and makes, again, these kind of spaces outside, which give you a place of entrance, a place of encounter with the building before you go in. The bit on the left was phase 2, which actually didn't happen on the further street. And the reason it didn't happen was because the Hungarian government effectively closed down, expelled CEU from Budapest, and they've had to move, and they're now moving to Vienna. So nobody knows what's going to happen to the buildings, but they've been, because they're considered to be too liberal, and George Soros is connected. And Viktor Orban hates George Soros, so he effectively pushed them out. The next project is also talking to old buildings, but also old friends, and it's Liverpool University School of Architecture, which we won in competition in 2018. And this was really important competition for us because John and I both worked for Jim Sterling, and he was a very important person in our lives, and our sense about how to make buildings and the relationship of buildings to use and site is very influenced by him. And he's hugely, he remained very associated with Liverpool and its School of Architecture, as did many other people like Bob Maxwell and Colin Rowe, who were all students at the same time there. And the School of Architecture they studied in was Georgian houses on the street and a 1930s building, which is a very nice building here. And that's a photograph of Sterling sitting up for some reason, pulled apart from all the other students in the year of his graduation. So, you know, he obviously already thought he was somebody. But by the time we came there, they'd added this kind of weird spaceship on the roof, and they'd filled in the courtyard, and it's kind of a mess. And it turns out the competition is not for a new school, but it's for an addition to that, to make a third part. So we were immediately thinking about place and context and how to somehow add to this existing train of buildings. So there's the oldest building, the 30s building, and then the site for us is here. And Liverpool, so looking that way, Liverpool Cathedral, which is an amazing kind of big wigwam built in about 1960, is visible from here, and a very important relationship is from our building towards the view to the cathedral, and it affects the shape of the building. The drawings and models that we made, I mean, we really were thinking about Sterling, and so we made these worm's eye views and worked in a way in a kind of homage to him in the way that we drew it. And so from the ground up, we wanted to think about how the building comes out of the ground being the actual site, but also the relationship with the other buildings, the groundwork, and then how it translates itself at roof level. So we were working through sketches and overlays and models. The second theme we were thinking about was space and character and atmosphere, and what is the School of Architecture? This is a studio-based school. So in a way, our project is to make this new building, which is like a series of overlapping and interconnected studios, which have a concrete structure at the base to stabilize them, and then it's a timber structure above that with these huge roof lights and 30-meter spans in wood. So it's it's like a table holding up a piece of timber furniture. And then we very much designed it we make 3D model and computer, and then I work over those and make these sketches and think about how to connect and make these spaces as a kind of continuous interior experience. This is the main studio, and the red stairs goes up to another part of the studio. These are spaces that are between the old and the new building, the kind of splice space, as we call it, which connect old and new. The entrance hall, which is a place for crits and exhibition and forums and discussions. And then I think the plan, we're really interested in plans, so everything begins with the plan. And a lot of the work in this competition was how to make sense of how this building connected to this building and then eventually to our new building. So there's a lot of things about taking out old stairs and putting in new ones and freeing up connections so that you could just come from the Georgian building through this building and eventually into this one. And then the plan is counted in this way because of the view to the cathedral down this side cut here, and the new main entrance to the school is here. And then, so I think I won't go into the detail of this, but what happens is that the levels are slightly different between the Georgian, the 1930s and the new. So we used ramps and made it so that we could smooth out, so someone could move all the way through the three buildings without having to encounter staircases, and we moved the lifts to make that happen. And then we wanted to make a meaningful whole, that the whole building had a kind of connected language. So it's all in brick, all three phases of the building. And we, for example, made the windows much bigger here and projected them as bay windows so you could see out of the studios as well as getting light in. And then we're thinking about the ground and the places that are made in, these are the oral competition drawings, the entrance, how it's carved out, that's the Beatles. There's a lot of Liverpool references when you see these drawings up close. And then we were looking at how to make this roof, the tectonics, and this is where we really were making the drawings, the sort of Stirling-esque worm's eye view drawings of how you would experience the roof structure and the structure at different levels within the building, because it seemed important that the School of Architecture would have an expressed structure. And then our environmental, we are very interested in environmental responsibility and robust materials that last long, that weather, thermal mass, natural light, ventilation, and of course how the building sits in relation to this cathedral building, which is where this angle, this is the garden outside, and maybe more typically on a nice Liverpool rainy day, that we hope that the three buildings will connect with each other. Conversations with Cultural Place, and this is the last project I'm going to talk about, which is our work in London, in East Bank, in Stratford waterfront, which is on the site of the Olympics, which was the subject of a competition in 2015 for a new cultural quarter, which was known as Olympicopolis, which was, Boris Johnson was the mayor of London at the time, and his title, Olympicopolis, which was a mouthful for most people, was, he had the idea of making it like Albertopolis, which is the Kensington collection of museums, including the V&A, the Natural History Museum, and up to the Albert Memorial in the park. So he wanted to make it kind of for the East End, which is really interesting, actually, and a really good intention to make this cultural quarter in the East End of London on the site of the Olympics. And it was an invited competition, and Kieran Long knows a lot about it because he was involved in the V&A at the time, and he was our client for some time. So the project has been through a number of iterations, and this one, the reason it says 2017 is this was the second version, which we, after the competition in 2015. And this is the site here, which is a really small, narrow piece of land beside Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Center and across the river and the park from the main stadium for the Olympics. And the project consists at one end of residential, so there are 4 residential towers here. Then there's the V&A, new museum for the V&A, a new building for London College of Fashion, BBC studios, and a dance studio for Sadler's Wells. And they're all collected together in this piece of ground with quite complex level changes. This is a bit out of focus maybe, but I like this drawing. It's a kind of X-ray drawing that we have made of showing an elevation from the Olympic Stadium so we designed the tower, which we call the prow on this end, the residential tower, and the new building for the V&A, which is in the middle, and they both sit at a lower level, and what you maybe can't see clearly here, then there's a podium at this level, which the other public buildings sit on, and so the 3 red ones are work that we've done in our studio, and this is the Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre. So it's been an amazing project for us. The housing isn't yet moving because they're still waiting to get a developer, but the other buildings, the cultural buildings, are under construction. A starting point, I suppose, was the map of the place. It was an industrial city, a industrial part of London with these amazing rivers and railways. So in a way, the character it has now, which is of being bits of land divided by trains and roads and rivers and canals, was actually always there, even back in the 19th century. But one thing we really noted in the map was that all the buildings, so our site is here, and that all the buildings extended from the road to the river. And that's what we decided we would do, that we'd make every building have 2 fronts on the road and the river. And this is imagining in the future on the train, seeing in the distance past the Aquatic Center, this collection of new buildings. And the one at the south end is the Sadler's Wells, which is a dance theatre and dance studios, which is one of the 2 projects that we're designing. And it's on a very square site, and it's a really interesting brief. It's 6 dance studios and a big flexible dance theatre. And every one of those rooms is predetermined as being rectangular and of certain dimensions. So there wasn't a sort of flexible thing that you could make the dance studio a particular shape. The dance studio has got to have right angle corners because choreographers, that isn't the case, I know, in the Laban Dance Centre, but choreographers will not accept. And actually we kind of enjoyed that idea that this building is made up out of a whole lot of boxy rooms which are similar in size. And the clients who are fantastic, and Sadler's Wells, they really wanted to feel ready for work. They wanted to feel open and welcoming to people, to feel almost not quite industrial, but have this kind of a working building. Work is made here, it's not just performed. So we came up with the language of the sawtooth roof. So there's 3 studios at the upper level have these strip windows here, but they also have north light there. And then the bigger studios at this level have big windows looking out behind screens to the south with a shared balcony. And then the public spaces are all around what looks like the ground, but actually isn't the ground because the levels change on the site. So the Aquatic Center is here. The public level that you enter is way up here, and 8 meters below there's a road where the stage and the backstage areas are. So the public come in at the top of a very steep rake into this auditorium, which has a retractable seating, and then the studios wrap around that. We were trying to think about this idea of the language. What is a dance? How do you express this idea of the set of separate rooms? And we were looking at these beautiful diagrams people make, choreographers make, of how dance steps work with the black and the white feet. And that made us think about this idea about the sawtooth roof, that the studios would each be expressed on one side, and then when it turns the corner, the circulation comes through here, and they're expressed again on that side. So it's a kind of rhythm in the form of the building, which relates to the idea of the kind of discipline and yet the movement that is involved in dance. And then this building is very much a brick and clay building. So it's made of these kind of purple bricks that we're importing from Italy. And then it gets more and more open as you come down to the public level. So at the public level, there's an L-shaped foyer, which is completely glazed. At the level above is the studios with the big windows, 3 studios here and a double height, and then the upper studios. And in the background, the fly tower of the main auditorium. And so the section is really simple, and the structure, very lightweight people dancing cause incredible vibration. And we had to use a concrete structure, and we had to use enormous beams, which we found very hard to accept, but they had to be this big because of the kind of vibrations that dance sets up. So the foyer runs under the studios, and at one point a studio is left out, so it becomes double height, and you can look over from the studio entrances to that. And then you simply have the lines of the structure coming down, and 3 studios on top of 2. And then in section in the other direction, the auditorium has this huge fly tower, because dance needs a very big stage and it needs a lot of props and sets to be moved around. But the audience are only experience the building from this level, and they come in and are able to see right down from the bar down through to the stage. And then on plan, it's because of the way the building is on a corner, so it's got these 2 public faces, and then it's actually semi-detached to the BBC next door. So the auditorium is in the dark corner, and the public space is kind of wrapped around in a series in one space, but it has a lot of recesses and nooks and crannies to allow for different kinds of activities, and allow it to feel, if there's only a few people there, that it isn't one big empty space. So we worked a lot on how to articulate that those public spaces that move through the building. And then in section, there's a big canopy on the south side to give you sheltered area outside the cafe and bar. And then in some places it's single height, and then it steps up to double height in the place I mentioned where the studios look down. And the long section is of a continuous bar and a cafe counters wrapping around the auditorium and the double height space above. And then the upper plan is really simple and orthogonal of 4 studios, and the black is the fly tower. And in a way, the thinking about one is easy to make the elevations on the 2 sides, which are public, but on then this side is the fly tower, so there are no windows, and we're trying to think how to do that. And we were looking at the Aurelian walls in Rome, and how, in a way, if you're thinking about designing a theatre, the Aurelian walls suddenly become a whole series of fly towers against a wall. So when we came back from Rome, we thought, okay, it's just you somehow use the potential brick has to be shaped and sculpted. And so we started working with these brick manufacturers in Treviso and getting brick samples made for different kinds of brick that we can use to make this really solid wall. And then it has, for example, this is a ventilation chimney, and it corbels out at this point, and there's a stairs which is angled against here. And there are other moments which are to do with the functionality of the building, which allowed us to make a sort of 3-dimensional sculpture of this incredibly solid brick wall which faces north. But then as you approach the entrance is at the corner, and then it becomes more open around the side until you come to this very open side here. And further down the same site, the V&A Museum is it's small in the sense that the building next door is very large, but it's a 5-story museum building, and the public have access to all 5 floors. So this section shows it in relation to the Olympic Park and the stadium here. And so all of the red is areas that are access to the public. So the building in a way fronts to this, and the service comes in at the back. And the brief, during the course of this competition, it used to have a lot of archive and accessible storage areas. Now it's really just an exhibition building. So it's like a sort of container for some fixed and some changing exhibitions. And we were trying to think, how do you make something? It's like a sort of precious casket. And there are spaces between the exhibition and the entrance that need to be like a buffer zone, that either for reasons of environmental or for reasons of movement give you this kind of in-between space. And we were in the National Gallery in Dublin looking at this beautiful Vermeer, and I said to John, isn't her sleeve amazing? It's like a sort of cubist painting or a modernist space. And we suddenly thought, could that be the outer wall of a museum? And then her arm inside is the exhibition, and then the gap between the arm and the sleeve is the kind of space of movement and what Japanese people call ma. And John had written in a book some years ago about this wonderful film, Notebooks on Cities and Clothes, or Wim Wenders, about Yohji Yamamoto. And there's a wonderful passage about how Wim Wenders puts on this jacket of Yamamoto and suddenly feels he's more himself in the jacket than he ever was before. And we're thinking of, and then there's beautiful scenes about him just cutting, before the models go on the catwalk, he's with the scissors, he's just catching them on the way out and cutting and trimming and adjusting the clothes. So we had this idea, we started making these models that wrap around the exhibition spaces in the middle, which are like the jacket or the sleeve or the ma, and give you room for example, big windows. They give you room for stairs. And at the same time as we were coming up with this idea, there was a great exhibition of Balenciaga in the V&A, and there was this amazing photograph in the middle, which is an X-ray photograph of one of Balenciaga's dresses, where you could see the structure and then the outside form. So we started drawing our sections as if they were kind of X-ray sections about the relationship between form and structure. And actually the surface, the engineer's drawing, because we had to have these huge piles going down into the ground. Also, it was part of the articulation of thinking about something that's canted and shaped, and then something that's more formed and formal inside. This was we're still at the stage, having just been allowed to travel back to London, of showing the baby pictures of the building on site. So this was a couple of months ago, before Christmas, before the cladding started, this incredible steel structure. But in fact, the building is clad in precast concrete, in big panels of precast with lines. We've drawn a lot of different kinds of lines and angles and incisions into this precast to make it the building like a kind of drawing. I mean, we're very interested in the fact that V&A is a craft museum. It has a museum full of objects, and it's full of beautiful things that are made and crafted. And so the craft of how you make precast concrete became a real subject that we got engaged in, because we felt the building should have this kind of crafted feeling. So just to simply explain it, at the lower level, there's this lower square, and most of this floor is back of house, but at this level there's a cafe and an entrance and a stairs. So the white is the public and the black is the delivery and all the back of house stuff here. And then at the level above, which is where the podium is, you can walk along the podium and in, which I suppose might be the main entrance, and the first exhibition space, which is here. And then there's shops and other public facilities here, and you start to move on the staircase, but you also overlook the cafe and the space below. And the stairs and the movement wrap around the rectangle, so that this kind of crust of angled stuff gives you the shop, it gives you the stairs, it gives you the services. And then you can see how the stairs works its way up past the different exhibition spaces to the top. And then on the upper level, this is a big exhibition space, which is a changing exhibition, which can be fitted out in different ways. So it's just a big box of space, really. And the stairs then continues to wrap around the side here to give maximum space for exhibition. And we've made models and studies of how that in-between space works and what it's like to be on the stairs and how you see from one level to another. And you can sort of see that in the section there too. And then it's wearing this dress of this incised precast, which is really beautiful material. And these were some of the samples earlier on. We're trying to get the color right, there are both raised kind of V's and incised V's. So it's a combination of projections and recessions, which will give a certain kind of staining and weathering over time. On the right, there's a sideways drawing, which one of the people in the office made, which is a folded out elevation of the whole building in order to work out. It's actually a really amazing drawing to work out the sizes and shapes of all the precast panels. And now the panels are going up. They're 2 meter high panels. So a panel goes, say, from there to there, and they vary in length up to about 12 meters long. And then they have these lines drawn at each angle. The pattern changes. So these angle lines are on this side, but they're only vertical lines on that side. So it gives a kind of You read, it'll intensify a sort of sense of shadow as you move around the building. And there are a very small number of windows, including the one that has a kind of eyebrow here, cut into the precast. And otherwise the windows are in these big V-shaped arches, which is, this is a view from the square level of the high arch, which encompasses 3 levels, and then the one just inside the entrance here. So I think that is me done. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I'm sure that there are questions in the audience. I might begin just to get it going. It seems to me, Sheila, that throughout your projects there is a red thread. Most of them, almost all of them, probably all of them, which is a section. And I get very excited about the sections in your. I mean, you talk about the plan,
Yeah.
but the sections seem to me to be a driving thing. So I'm a bit curious about, because I know your drawings and that are amazing, but you also work in model.
Yes.
Early on.
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
Would you say a few words about the section?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I think we would say that a section is just a plan, a vertical plan. So I think that, in fact, there are some moments in some of our projects, because in the Furniture College in Letterfrack, which I just briefly showed at the beginning, which has these big timber roofs, when we came later to do another project, the plan of the other project is sort of similar to the section of Letterfrack, because we're just trying to, I think it's like you cut the building vertically or you cut it horizontally. So while I say everything starts with the plan, sometimes the plan is almost like a vertical thing. And I think that is quite important, that the three-dimensional aspect of a space or of a building has a kind of integrity that it needs to. And sometimes the plan and the section are very similar, and that's also interesting. Like maybe even the Sadler's Wells dance, which is so rectangular that the places where the section breaks up to have a gap in the studios is about trying to express that sense of a kind of repeated plan at 2 levels, so that the section kind of cuts through the 2 levels. So yes, section is definitely really important. It's true we tend to say it starts with the plan, and the plan in a way kind of comes out of the ground, but of course the section comes out of the ground too. And if, as is often the case, we're working on a sloping site or something, then the section is automatically a section aspect to the building from the beginning. And the funny thing about those buildings in London is that there's a kind of it's like it's a brownfield, almost tabula rasa site, but because of infrastructure already there from the Olympics, there's this 8-meter level change, which is it's a manufactured level change to allow all the Olympic part. Once you'd paid into the Olympics, you could move around everywhere above the roads and the trains, and that remained as our starting point. So even in a building on what feels like a flat piece of ground, there's a kind of landscape of section. So yes, section, it is very important. Maybe it's a sort of sleight of hand to not ever mention the section, but I would say it is a really important generating factor, because it is how you read the connections between the different parts of a building, is obviously in the section. Sometimes you can look at the plans and then the section suddenly resolves an understanding of how the parts connect.
There's also in that Corbusier always said that, the project that you manage within that rectangle, within the cube, is the most difficult. I'm thinking of the theatre in Liverpool, and also in that project you manage through the section, I think, to get that incredible complexity of spatial relations. So that, I thought that was very, very exciting. But then there are difficulties also with the section because of the fire regulations, and also in cold climates you get all the hot air rising.
Yep.
So
well, that was really interesting. In Budapest we worked with a really good environmental architect on our team, and where we came up with that shape of the roof. And that the climate there goes from -20 at one point of the year to +40 another time. So we really had to think how to make it not be overheated and not be cold. And we worked a lot with just this, and in fact that shape is probably the most we've ever worked with. The shape of the roof really did evolve from looking at the movement of air and how it moves at different times of the year and how you open one part to to ventilate and to make comfortable conditions. That's also really interesting that nowadays when we're trying to think about how to have less servicing in buildings, how you can use natural movement that sections give you to either cool or warm spaces.
Hi, thanks for an amazing lecture, intense and so full of fantastic things. But I wanted to ask you a question about I've had the fortunate experience of seeing many of your works and some of the works you talked about. There's always an incredible intricacy that you create in the public spaces of your buildings. They wrap and they circulate. And I'm thinking also of the theatre we visited together, I think, in Dublin some years ago. But the Olympic Park is really like an alien environment compared to the Rome and the Greek, the environments you love. Is it always possible to create that intricacy? And what do you think the difference will be of your work landing in that, landscape of gigantic, uncontextual objects?
I think it will be different. It won't become Rome or Venice. It just isn't going to happen. And actually, that was something we felt very clearly from the start, and which is why at the beginning of the competition, working with Allies and Morrison, we came up with the idea, well, maybe it's more like an American city where the buildings are objects. Because I still find amazing thing, and you go to America, and a street is a street, but actually it feels like a lot of separate buildings that happen to be beside each other, whereas a street in most European cities feels much more of a continuum. So I think that's why I say maybe one of the reasons why the V&A building has all the articulation is partly to make it sit, well, I think we did think of it as being like a little casket or a little precious thing. And the Sadler's Wells, which in a way is a more, because there's big cafes and bars and there's community dance and all kinds of activities and classes for kids in hip hop, it needs to have a very permeable edge. So we have the canopy and we have we've tried to engage with the space beyond the building to carry it a bit further beyond its own enclosure. But I think the intricacies will be kind of in the building and in the edges of the buildings. And then I think we hope beyond that. There is going to be an enormous flight of public steps, like a sort of long forum, because of the level change, which is and there'll be planting. And so it could be quite an interesting place, but it will not be like those traditional European cities. But I think the Olympic Park is interesting because it continues to improve. I mean, it's quite a good park. It's a very nice park. And as things mature, it becomes a better and better neighbour to be looking from and to. So I think you were involved at the early stages and in the assessment, but we had an idea in the competition about adding a new bridge, which we thought actually did some of that. We just put one new bridge in that brought you up to so at one level you could go down to the lower level up to the podium, which they decided for cost reasons not to build. And I think that's a pity because I think it could have done with some kind of articulation of the public realm that extended over to the park. So it does become more joined up rather than you come over from the park and then you meet this enormous place full of what are going to be, I think, remarkable cultural institutions and a whole new community. Because there's a college there, it means there will automatically be a community of young people in the College of Fashion who are already animating the place. And a really important thing is to bring local people in and that it doesn't feel too precious or intimidating or high culture. And I think that's probably something that all of the clients of the institutions are really working to make happen, to have activities that bring local people in. So yeah, I think actually I realize something we've often talked about, we don't have an exact model for what it is like. So yeah, come back to us in a few years. I don't know. I mean, we're at the stage now where it's been very slow, I suppose partly because of COVID and for other reasons, but we're 2 years into construction now, but most of the buildings will take a while more because the V&A is going to the fit out is going to happen after the construction is finished. So it's probably going to be another 2 years before we can go down there and meet people and see how it actually works.
Thank you again, Sheila, for a very generous lecture and very instructive. And inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.